You're looking at a street that three religions call holy. But in 1095, before any crusader set foot here, this was just another neighborhood. Watch your step on these stones. Someone exactly like you walked here every single day, shopping for bread, arguing about taxes, falling in love. The question isn't what made this place sacred. The question is, what was it like when it was simply home? Jerusalem in 1095 held maybe 15,000 souls within walls that you could walk in 20 minutes. But these weren't just any 15,000 people. Muslims ruled the city under Fatimid authority. Christians lived here as protected minorities, managing their own affairs. Jews maintained a small but persistent presence after centuries of displacement. 3 continents funneled their wealth through these gates: spice caravans from India, silk from China, gold from Africa.
European pilgrims carried silver coins earned in distant fields. This was the crossroads economy before anyone called it a battlefield. The Golden Dome dominated everything. Abd al-Malik had built it 4 centuries earlier, but by 1095, it represented something larger than architecture. This was the 3rd holiest site in Islam, the place where Muhammad ascended to heaven during his night journey. Muslim pilgrims traveled months to reach this spot. They'd circle the rock 7 times, just like their brothers circled the Kaaba in Mecca. But here's what no history book tells you. On any given morning, you'd find local children playing in the courtyard between prayers. This wasn't just a monument, it was their neighborhood mosque.
Walk south from the dome, and you'd enter a prayer hall that could hold 5,000 worshippers. The Aqsa Mosque, the farthest mosque mentioned in the Quran. But most days, it was barely half full. Therefore, space meant community. Merchants would spread prayer rugs beside scholars. Travelers from Baghdad would pray next to local craftsmen. The Friday sermon echoed in Arabic, but conversations afterward mixed Arabic with Persian, Turkish, even broken Greek from Byzantine traders who'd stayed too long and forgotten why they'd come. 3 blocks west, Christianity's holiest site operated under a fascinating arrangement. Muslims controlled the keys, but Christians maintained the building. Why? Because every Christian denomination wanted exclusive access, and they'd rather trust Muslim arbitration than each other.
Byzantine Greeks managed the main altar. Armenians controlled the chapel of St. Helena. Syrian Orthodox Christians maintained their section in the back. Latin Christians, the ones we'd later call Catholics, held specific hours for their rituals. Therefore, the building hummed with constant activity. Someone was always praying, cleaning, arguing about protocol, or negotiating next week's schedule, the souks and daily life. But the real Jerusalem lived in its markets. The covered souk connected Damascus Gate to the mosque area through stone-vaulted passages. Spices from India perfumed the air. Frankincense from Arabia burned in small bronze censers. Silk merchants displayed their wares on wooden boards suspended between stone columns. Your great-grandmother might have walked these exact stones, testing the weight of pottery, arguing over the price of olive oil.
The vendors called out in Arabic, but prices were negotiated in whatever language worked. A handful of Byzantine gold bought the same bread as Fatimid dinars, or even Christian pilgrims' strange northern coins. Eastern Christians, Armenians, Syrians, Copts, had carved out residential neighborhoods where Arabic mixed with their liturgical languages. Their children grew up trilingual without thinking about it. They attended mosque prayers on Friday out of civic duty, but filled their own churches on Sunday. These families had survived Persian invasions, Byzantine reconquest, Arab conquest, and now Fatimid rule. Therefore, they'd mastered the art of adaptation. Pay your taxes, keep your head down, maintain your traditions quietly. Their wooden balconies overlooked streets where Muslim children played the same games their Christian neighbors did.
The Jewish community occupied the smallest space, but maintained the longest memory. Families traced their presence here to the Second Temple period, 8 centuries before Muhammad was born, 13 centuries before any European had heard of a crusade. They managed small businesses, metalworking, money changing, medicine. Their synagogue could barely hold 30 people, but those 30 people carried the weight of continuous residence that predated everyone else in the city. They prayed facing the Western Wall, visible through their small windows,
and debated the same theological questions their ancestors had argued when this was the center of the world.
Southwest from the Jewish quarter, stone walls close in around a world that barely changed for 600 years. This is the Armenian quarter, quiet, inward-looking, deliberate. The monastery isn't just a church, it's a fortress of memory. Thick walls, a bell tower that rings in a city dominated by the call to prayer. Inside the courtyard, chickens wander between stone columns. Children recite prayers in a language older than most empires surrounding them. Armenians arrived here in the 4th century. By 1095, they were experts at survival. They owned olive groves outside the walls. They copied manuscripts for churches as far away as Anatolia. But they rarely involved themselves in city politics. Therefore, when rumors of war circulated, and they always circulated, Armenians listened quietly, watched carefully, and waited like they always had.
Outside the walls, the Mount of Olives. Now leave the city. Step through the eastern gate and climb the Mount of Olives. This hillside is covered in stone graves, thousands of them, stacked in terraces facing the Temple Mount. Jews believed resurrection would begin here. Christians believed Jesus would return here. Muslims honored the prophets buried along the slope. Death in Jerusalem was never neutral. Families come daily to visit tombs. Women leave small stones on graves. Old men sit in the shade of olive trees and argue theology with strangers. From here, the city looks peaceful. Golden dome, white walls, thin lines of smoke rising from cooking fires. But this view hides the tension below. Jerusalem always looks calm from a distance. The Kidron Valley. Between the city and the Mount of Olives runs the Kidron Valley, deep, dry, and lined with tombs carved directly into the rock. These graves are ancient even by medieval standards. Kings, prophets, nobodies who wanted to be buried near holiness. Water only runs here after rare rains, turning dust into mud and carrying scraps of city life downhill. This valley isn't a border, it's a reminder. Every army that ever approached Jerusalem passed through here. Every pilgrim, every conqueror, every refugee. In 1095, it's quiet, but history never stays quiet for long. The Pool of Siloam. Follow the valley south and you reach the city's oldest lifeline. The Pool of Siloam collects water from underground channels cut centuries earlier. Stone steps descend into cool darkness. Women fill jars. Children splash despite being yelled at.
This water feeds homes, gardens, ritual baths. No water, no Jerusalem. Therefore, this place is guarded, maintained, and respected by everyone. Muslim officials oversee it. Jewish families use it for ritual purity. Christian pilgrims wash their hands here before entering the city. In a siege, this pool would matter more than any holy site, and everyone knows it. Now walk back into the city, through narrow streets that future generations will call sacred. In 1095, this is just a road, stone underfoot, doorways opening directly into workshops and homes. Donkeys squeeze past carrying firewood. A man repairs sandals by the light of an oil lamp. A woman leans from a balcony yelling at her son. Pilgrims already walk this route, retracing what they believe was Christ's final path. But locals don't stop their lives for pilgrims. You step aside, you keep walking, you finish your errands.
In 1095, Jerusalem is not yet a battlefield. It is ruled, taxed, prayed over, argued about, and loved. Its people wake up worried about food, family, debts, weather, not about holy war. Muslims call it Al-Quds, the holy. Christians call it Jerusalem, the heavenly city. Jews call it Yerushalayim, the city of peace. But peace here has always been fragile.
Within months, armies will come. Meanings will harden. Stones will remember blood instead of footsteps. So remember this version. A city where children played in sacred courtyards, where holy places doubled as neighborhoods, where history hadn't yet decided what this place would cost. This was Jerusalem, before the Crusades.
Your ancestors might have been among the Crusaders, or among the people they killed, or among the Eastern Christians caught in between. History has a way of making us choose sides for wars our families never fought. But before we argue about who belonged here, maybe we should ask, what would it have felt like to just live here? To buy groceries on Friday morning, worry about your children's future, fall asleep to the sound of your neighbor's prayers drifting through stone walls. Someone exactly like you called this place home.
They had no idea they were living through the end of an era. Which city should we time travel to next? The comment section is your time machine. Tell me where curiosity is pulling you, and I'll meet you there with another story no one remembers to tell.